Hi, I want to make a video about how you argue with people and how you want to argue with someone when you're trying to argue about something that you know to be true, and why the people that you're arguing with may not accept the truth if you act a certain way, if you are arguing for the truth, if you're on the right side. So, this is something that I know through my own experience and how people react to you when you're arguing, or you're trying to point something out, and you can't come off too aggressive, or you can't come off too weak. You can't come off too meek or weak. Otherwise, they won't take what you have to say seriously. So when you're talking to someone, and you find out that they were lying, or you're trying to prove a point that what they're saying is obviously false, you're trying to catch someone or get someone out of a delusion or something that they don't know is a lie, and you're trying to fix the problem, you have to be careful with how you argue with someone. And you usually have to use very precise tactics, especially when you're arguing with someone that's obviously that doesn't want to accept the truth, and they know it's the truth, and you almost have to find them and convince them through acting just the right way to convince them emotionally to accept the truth that you're trying to convince them of. And if you're not doing it just right, I guess I can categorize this, I'm going only based off of speculation and my own experience and my own opinion of what I think is the best way to argue with someone, because all it is opinion. You can try your best, and different tactics work for different people, and that's exactly the point I'm trying to prove in this video. So, when you're trying to catch someone in a lie, say they have chocolate on their hands, and you see chocolate on the refrigerator, and you see spilt chocolate milk or chocolate in the refrigerator, and the person says they didn't do it, make the accusation that they did it, and they say they didn't do it. Well, I think in that situation, you are going to know if that person is lying if they say they didn't do it. And it's about how you react to that. And I think that in a way you can be direct, but you have to make sure you're... And that's why people are so scared of, telling the truth. You can't overreact, otherwise a person's not going to want to tell you that they did something wrong. Even if the evidence is right in front of you, they'll lie. And I'm mostly talking about how the typical person, average person, acts in these situations, and that's why I would call it the sheeple or the Borg, and how they react. And it's mostly about trying to convince someone of the truth, but I felt like I wanted to go through these individually and describe just situations just to add as an add-on in this video. And I think when you're trying to convince someone, trying to catch one, and this is all relevant anyway, but I keep changing the subject. Yes, it is relevant. You're trying to catch someone in a lie, and you want to be nice as best you can, because that can prevent all sorts of trouble to begin with. So you have to be nice to the person. And I've been on both sides of this equation, because I've been scared of people getting mad at me before and lying. But it's never been extreme in my example, and it's usually the other person, and I have to deal with lying a lot, so it's something I've had to deal with on a regular basis, dealing with a lot of mostly just a few people that are dishonest, and I have to deal with that on a regular basis. So it's something that I can say personally. They have to be nice when you're catching someone in a direct lie, otherwise you just cause tension on both sides and make it even harder the next time. So, yeah, if you found out the chocolate was on their hands and the chocolate milk was spilled, just confront them in the best possible way. And I guess that you can't necessarily do that in a philosophical argument when you're trying to convince someone of the truth, because you have to come off in a very specific way, almost funny. It's almost like a cult of personality. You have to have your own, you have to add your own, your clever nature, if you have any. You have to be funny, or you have to be humble, or both, and you have to make it seem appealing what you're talking about. And that's why you have to be very precise when you're dealing with the average person, when you're dealing with an argument, arguing with someone. And when you're arguing a philosophical point, sort of like, an obvious one or a non-obvious one, when you say the Earth's round and they say they don't know, and they live in the modern society and they deny that, then in a way they're emotionally attached to the idea, or they're extremely deluded. And when you're dealing with an extremely deluded person, it's best, I would say, I haven't dealt with many extremely deluded people in my experience, but if they're arguing something like that, I would say probably don't come off too aggressive and be reasonable with your point. I guess this is in a way very similar to the other point I was making with catching a person in a direct lie. But I would say that you have to be more careful in this one. You can't just be nice, but you have to word it right. You ask them why you believe what they're doing. You have to sort of sneak in with the argument when you have to be clever enough to know how to deal with this kind of person, especially when they're deluded in a certain way. You have to be sneaky, and when they're deluded, they're probably not their mind is probably jumbled in certain ways where you can sneak in a little easier, but it's going to be a little harder to convince, I would think. I don't know. And I would say when you're dealing with a person that's emotionally attached to a certain idea, because obviously when you're arguing with someone, you're usually dealing with emotions, especially when it comes to the truth, or there's a strange disconnect from their personal experience and what they're going to accept as the truth. And I think I have mentioned this before about this disconnect between the fact that people can live in fantasy, but they feel like if they acknowledge that their fantasy isn't real and it's just fantasy, and they accept the truth, the obvious truth, or otherwise a difficult truth, something that they don't necessarily obviously know. And when you're arguing the facts, you do have to be careful, and you do have to be nice with the points that you're making. You gotta be able to sneak it in, and you almost have to argue. Sorry, I lost my train of thought in the middle of that sentence, but you have to, in a way, emotionally, and sometimes people do understand each other more when they know each other better, but this is almost in a way assuming you're talking to a stranger or a person you know has strong convictions to begin with. So if you're doing that, then you can try to relate to them in a way and ask them why, and in a way you have to sneak it in again, because you can't come off too aggressive, because people will reinforce their own beliefs more than likely doing that. They won't accept anything you're saying and in a way deny it completely. Or they may say you're right or rub it off if they can't completely deny it and say that's your opinion and this is my opinion. You can't prove it, and that's the whole point of the argument you're having to begin with. So I would say, in the average person, you do have to be very careful with how you're arguing with them, otherwise the point you're making is going to go straight over their head. And you can't have that in an argument, especially when you keep coming back. You've got to be careful, and you have to make sure the first time you argue, it's about the first impressions in the arguments, and if the person doesn't have a pretense knowing how you're going to talk to them and try to convince them of something, then they're going to have less defenses open. But if they know that you've tried this over and over again, either from hearsay or from their previous experience with you, then they may come up with more barriers up, and in that process you're going to probably have to break them down more, and they're going to come in with an assumption that you're going to probably try to convince them of something they don't necessarily want to think or don't think or know is true. So I think you have to be careful in every situation when you're talking to someone and trying to convince them of something. And you can't be too weak, and you can't be too meek, and that's what I said in the beginning of this video. And I would say that because you have to exert yourself and know, and in a way people want you to act a certain way. They want to feel like you're on their level when you're arguing with them. So when you start using too many facts and start saying certain things too much or being redundant, then it starts going straight over their head. You can't talk too long or go on a point too long, because those go straight over their head too, and it almost went away. If you don't make your point clever enough and to the point enough, where you're describing it as accurately and precisely as possible instead of going on about explaining the color of, I mean, the shape. I'm trying to think of an example. The describing something like why the world is round. You can't go on, and you can't make a whole paragraph or a whole paper out of what you're saying. You just have to be to the point, describe it accurately and precisely as possible, in as short a way as possible. Otherwise, that'll give the person time to get lost, have an excuse to get lost in what you said, or it'll give them reason or a way to get distracted and find something to counter-argue you with, only to lose your opportunity to, at the easiest possible moment, possibly convince them of what you know to be the truth, or that you think to be the truth at the very least. It's all about arguing what you know and trying to convince others. And I would say that to the original point, yes, you have to be very precise. Trying to remember, I'm losing train of thought, and you have to be precise, and you can't be too logical, and you have to be straight and to the point. And when you start using too many number-type logical statements, like you give them all the facts, like you're explaining a math problem, or you're explaining the shape of the world with all these statistics and all this math and all these equations, or the speed of light, when you're trying to describe that, what you need to do is more likely show them a diagram, illustrate it for them, drawn on a piece of paper, so the person can't manipulate what you're saying because it's right in front of both of you. I think that's a good idea, and that's one of the things that you can use to make sure that the person's not manipulating the argument in any way against you, so that you both know what you're looking at and they can't misinterpret it because it's right in front of them, and they can't argue with it because the argument's already been said and it's been laid out right in front of you. Or pre-record something, I don't know. And this is usually an example of after you've already tried, unless you're carrying around things as if you're wanting to get into an argument. So you have to be careful, and you can't be too weak. Just want to make sure I have everything in this video before I decide to give up, because I know there's probably another point I'm trying to make, but I got lost in changing the subject constantly to make sure I did get all the points, but I probably lost in translation the points I was going to make originally. So yes, you have to be precise. You always got to be nice. You have to relate to the person, especially when you know where they're coming from emotionally, especially when it's an obvious fact, like the world being round. Or they'll say that it doesn't, there's no proof of that and it's all subjective. Well, just because you describe something as subjective, it is what it is no matter what you say. Just because the words we use are just descriptors, you can't deny. I mean, you can look the other way and say that doesn't exist, but the computer or you point to a doorknob or whatever, and they can say, well, that's not a doorknob to me. I call that a tape measure, or I call that a picture. Well, obviously these are extreme examples, but it doesn't matter what you call it. It's a descriptor, and the doorknob's still a doorknob by any meaningful standard. It is a doorknob unless you want to go, well, that's not a doorknob, that's precisely something else. Or that's precisely something else over there. And if you want to go into details, you're going to the point of irrelevancy, if that's a way to describe it. It's still a doorknob, and that's what's commonly accepted, and that's what the definition explains as something that does exist in reality is. And that's a good thing. It's about illustrating, and they can say it, you can call it whatever you want. Anyone denying something, that's fine, but it is what it is regardless. It is a doorknob, and the word doorknob is just a descriptor for what the physical thing is, or the concept of physical possibility, or not the possibility, but the physical construction of something, the physical presence of something. It still is exactly what it is, and the descriptor is irrelevant when you're pointing it out. And you can call it whatever you want, it still is what it is. So the other point about the argument is, I might have to go through the points again just to remember what I'm saying. So I think it was about being nice and not being too logical with the argument. And you're trying to prove something to a person. You got to be on their. Oh yes, And you have to be an emotional connection with them, and if you know them better, usually they'll understand what you're saying, because there's more of a mutual understanding when you know someone more. Or if you go in, yes, that's obviously something. You go into it mutually understanding something, like a debate. You mutually understand where you're going into it, so in a way you have more time to prepare, and you know exactly how you're arguing. So obviously that's more difficult than dealing with an argument that you don't expect, but you already have some idea of how to combat something that you do expect in a world where there's obviously going to be people attacking what you believe, and there's a constant offense to our sensibilities and our beliefs. So yes, you have to argue on their level. They want you to feel like you're on their level when you're arguing. That's why I said the logical points, they can get lost in that. They can find an excuse to get lost in that. They don't, and it's an excuse to find something to say, and if you whine it out too long, they'll have absolutely all the reason in the world to find a reason not to believe what you say, or find some argument or some escape of the argument, some scapegoat, some reason, some excuse. And I would say that when you're arguing, you have to be on their level, and I think that's one of the most important things. Be nice, be humble, be on their level. Unless, obviously, you've done this before and it didn't work. Obviously, taking a more aggressive approach can be a solution, but I don't necessarily know if that's the case. You have to be aggressive in the right way. There's always a precise way to deal with certain people, and that's what I'm saying. The typical average person requires you to say something a very specific way. Otherwise, they're going to find a reason not to believe you, deny what you're saying, because they don't want you to prove that they're wrong. It's an ego thing too, and that's why you have to come off humble and soft and on their level. Otherwise, they're going to have more of an egotistical reason in their head to believe that you're just trying to play an ego game with you. And in many cases, that's obviously, at least subconsciously, what you're trying to do, but that's not always the case. So I would think that you got to be on their level. You can't make it out seem to be an ego game, yelling and saying, "Oh, I win the argument. Aha, you lose, you win." Isn't a good solution to solving an argument, because it's not going to get anywhere, especially when you thrust it in their face that, "Ha I proved it." They can almost back out after they admit it and say, and then you know it's an emotional thing then. But I think that it's a good thing. You need to argue on their level, otherwise they're going to find absolutely no reason to believe what you're saying. So I think that covers everything what I wanted to say. You got to be humble and nice. You got to be on their level. You got to understand where they're coming from. You can't be redundant in what you're saying, otherwise they're going to find reason to not take what you say seriously. So I think I've covered most everything I was going to say. And I hope I didn't get lost in translation, linking different subjects together. So I do hope that this video was informational. I may have missed a point I wanted to say, but it was long and wound out, and I lost my train of thought a lot. So I just thought I can always add that in some other video, obviously. But I think that's it for now. This is a long one, so I think I'll end it now, and I hope you enjoyed whatever. And have a good night, day, or whatever. Bye. See you later. And all that good stuff. Bye.